Good evening, everyone. And first of all, many thanks to the Ideas Network for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm actually, more than my paper, I'm really looking forward to continuing to learn from all of you for these times in Sri Lanka. And just by way of, just to let you know where I'm coming from, I wear maybe three hats. One, I'm the chair of the Northern Cooperative Development Bank, which is the federation of all the cooperatives, about 1,200 cooperatives in the northern province, the war-affected northern province of Sri Lanka. So in that capacity, a lot of my engagement is with the rural economy. And two, trade unions have a huge role to play now. And all our universities in Sri Lanka are state universities. And we have a Federation of University Teachers Association, and I'm a vice president of that currently. So trade unions have a really important role. We are not the most militant, I'll be frank, but the students are way ahead of us. But now as repression comes down, I think there's an important role for university teachers in that context. And thirdly, I'm a university teacher, probably my weakest role here in terms of trying to understand. But I think what I want to say is also, in a way, the kind of looking at the crisis now, the kind of the failure of the intellectual class in Sri Lanka. It's the working people who have taken forward the struggle. Even those of us who saw this coming, we could not socialize the message in terms of addressing the crisis. So at the outset, the main reason I came, I'll start with that and then move to my presentation. I have a request, a challenge to this network maybe, in terms of what we would like to see from Sri Lanka. One, maybe at the end of this conference next week, a statement from economists here on not just Sri Lanka, but a lot of what other countries are facing in terms of the debt crisis and possible ways forward. Sri Lanka's discussion of the economy is completely dominated by neoliberals, and they think IMF is the solution. So some kind of statement like that, I think, would be really welcome. Two, neither in Sri Lanka or many parts of the world, as we know, this crisis is going to be long, prolonged. Some kind of a working group or committee from the Ideas Network to be able to continue to engage with it so it doesn't stop with this week. And three, some of us are happy to host it, a workshop in Colombo, if possible, in the next 6 months, with some of you coming there to be able to engage the movements, the activists, the academics there would be really welcome. So that's the most important part of my presentation. And then I'll get to my paper, which I'm working on, is in 4 short sections. The character of this crisis in Sri Lanka, there are different interpretations of it. And maybe I've been writing on this, but maybe I'll try to sum up how I see this crisis. 2, the current dynamics as the crisis is unfolding, the kind of knock-on effects. And here I'm hoping to get a lot of your ideas, if not during this panel, over dinner and the next few days, how to analyze the dynamics of this, what I'm calling a long depression that is setting in Sri Lanka. 3, the debatable alternatives that some of us are trying to put forward. And 4, really broader questions. Is there a paradigmatic shift in terms of the kind of questions that we should engage with? So if you had to look at the crisis in Sri Lanka, obviously but we are seeing the war in Ukraine, the huge increase in prices, that's had an impact in terms of the crunch time, right? How quickly everything deteriorated. global oil prices. So fuel prices in Sri Lanka have now tripled for ordinary citizens. The price of bread has tripled. And part of that has to do with the war in Ukraine, part of it with the devaluation of our currency, which has 200 rupees to $1 to 360, so almost doubled, and all that has been passed on. But obviously, this is much longer in the making. The pandemic, we get a lot of foreign earnings from the tourism sector, foreign remittances. And in March 2020, many of us started saying, okay, we are headed in a crisis for sure, a balance of payment crisis. The government did little to, we might have got there sooner or later, but not this quickly. They completely mismanaged. Before that, there was a drought from 2016 to 2017, which set the stage for the Rajapaksas to come back. And then 2019, the Easter attacks, which you might remember, which also, to a large extent, shut down the tourism sector. But also, if you look at portfolio capital flows into Sri Lanka, there was probably in 2016 about $5 billion US. By 2019, the Easter attack suddenly reduced to 500 million. So you can see the kind of the trajectory and the trend. But I see this as longer than that. With the end of the war in Sri Lanka, a 26-year-long civil war in May 2009, it coincided with the global financial crisis. And with the global financial crisis, we saw global capital flow into what we call the emerging markets. The war ended in May 2009. Sri Lanka went into an IMF agreement in 2009, July, a standby arrangement. And after that, we saw, our first sovereign bond was floated in 2007, a series of floatings of sovereign bonds. Our stock market between 2009 and the end of, in 18 months, quadrupled, the best performing stock market in the world in that period. So you can, and I've kind of characterized this as the second wave of neoliberalism in Sri Lanka. We saw, greater financialization absorbed in urban development and infrastructure development, which did not provide the returns, which is the accumulation of debt that we are facing. But I would even take it a step back, much longer. Sri Lanka was the first country in South Asia to liberalize its economy going back to 1977 by a very powerful regime, similar to the way in which Gotabaya came, but the Jayawardena regime, and Jayawardena happens to be the uncle of the current President Ranil Wickremesinghe. And Jayawardena is interesting. I was thinking of Nongo's presentation. In 1949, he was finance minister. He waited a long time to capture state power. When he went to the United States, instead of, because we were pegged to the sterling, to create our own monetary sovereignty, and he brought John Exter as the central bank governor and to write the program for the central bank. And our first central bank governor was an American. So there are different ways in which imperialism can work, through kind of that brute force of assassinations, but also in terms of setting a regime in different ways. And so the crisis goes back to 1977 in terms of liberalization of trade, of agriculture, of large development, which creates a dependency, which for me is important as we think about the crisis now in terms of what changed in that period. In July 1980, Jayawardena attacked the trade unions. He crushed the trade unions, from which 4 decades later, the trade unions still haven't recovered, to set it on that neoliberal path. Of importance, made Sri Lanka much more dependent on food. We're only 40% self-sufficient in milk foods. We are an island nation. We import the equal amount of seafood as we export, about 250 million US dollars. So all that was said. We had a public distribution system and a food subsidy in the 70s, and he dismantled that. So imagine with this kind of food crisis now, if we had that food subsidy, if we had the public distribution system, and those are things to think about. Now, I think you've heard enough about the crisis, but what I'm trying to work through are the dynamics of the current crisis. The establishment, whether it's the opposition, the party in power, all of them, they have one solution to this crisis. That is the IMF. That's the magic bullet that is supposed to save us. In fact, we defaulted on our external debt worth 51 billion in April. I would say it was an engineered default with a lot of pressure, because they thought once you default, you have no option but to go to the IMF. So the neoliberals also get it wrong. Now we are not even capable of borrowing, getting any bridge financing from even China or Japan, because once you default, who's going to lend to you? But they were that confident about the IMF, and now the IMF is playing hardball. They are delaying the IMF agreement because they want political stability. They want us to first restructure the debt. So this game is going on. But what's happened over the last 6 months, the aggravation of the crisis, is that we are already implementing the IMF's recommendations. Devaluation, as I mentioned, with the rupee, interest rate hikes. The central bank's policy rate has gone up from 6% to 15.5%. Market pricing energy. They're going to go after the utilities. And we are really worried about, already, I think the cabinet has made a decision to break up the Ceylon Electricity Board. Sri Lanka is unique. We still have free education and free healthcare, which are the reasons for a high human development indicators from the 1940s and 50s. 99% of Sri Lanka is electrified. Most households, say the bottom 40, 50% of the households, they only pay $1.50, 500 rupees for their electricity bill. Now they're going to, there'll be a push to privatize electricity. So there's a lot at stake in terms of what comes up with this. And along with this, there is what we have seen now. There's 60% inflation in the last 6 months. 60%. Food inflation is 90%. But this is all imported inflation. Wages have not gone up. In fact, livelihoods have been disrupted. So the income streams of working people, 60% of our economy is the informal sector, have greatly reduced. We are looking at, even according to the World Bank or IMF, 6 to 7% contraction of the economy. I would probably put it, somewhere maybe much higher than that. Negative 6 to 7%. So it's a depression, and one that is already being created with austerity. And the discussion among the establishment is that, well, when we go to the IMF agreement, we'll have to have austerity. No, we've already got it. And what we are seeing, the protest is a reaction to all of that. And the agrarian question has been completely, in the 1970s, we had, many of you might know, we had very strong political economy work in Sri Lanka. People like Newton Gunasinghe, Kumari Jayawardena, but that was completely abandoned. The agrarian question was addressed in Sri Lanka with one line. 30% of our workforce produces 8 or 9% of GDP. That's all they had to say about the agrarian question. Now we are in a food crisis. So you can see the kind of contradictions and the ironies that are coming up. Now with all of that, there's huge amount of pressures in terms of people's provisioning, about social reproduction. Very, already in the rural households, and as I mentioned, I work with the cooperatives, we are seeing people only eating 1 or 2 meals a day. And this is not the Sri Lanka that we knew even during the war. So the kind of huge suffering that's being unleashed. Or you look at what's happening with you've probably seen on TV, the fuel queues. People spending sometimes a day, 2 days to get fuel. That is fuel that is costing 3 times the price? Who pays for that labor time? So all of this compounded, and it's very hard to put it in data because it's developing month to month. How do we analyze the length of this depression is something that I'm hoping that you guys would help me think through. Maybe I'm kind of seen as the doom and gloom person the last few years in Sri Lanka, and unfortunately the doom is unfolding. So hopefully we can have some more positive message from discussions, but looks very bleak. The alternatives that we've been able to, some of us have been able to conjure, is that we have to prioritize imports. So there is this idea that somehow we'll go to the IMF, an agreement, we'll be able to go back to the capital markets, borrow again, roll over debt. This is what we did. In 2016, January, George Soros and various economists came and had an economic forum with Ranil Wickremesinghe as prime minister. And they said, we're going to become a Singapore. This is 6 years ago. 3 months later, they said, we have a crisis. We have to go for a new budget. 6 months later, we went for an IMF agreement for $1.5 billion US, an EFF. The next month, we went and borrowed 1.5 billion in the capital market. So that's what IMF agreements have meant, I think, that a lot of you have been talking about. So this kind of idea, it's now clear there's no money that's going to come into the country. So, but Sri Lanka still gets anywhere from 1.3 to 1.6 billion US in foreign earnings. Actually, our exports are increasing the last few months, partly probably supported by the devaluation. How do you manage an economy if an IMF agreement is going to be prolonged and going to the capital markets having defaulted is not an option. It's not a desirable option to start with, but it's not even possible from the neoliberal point of view. What can you do to kind of the food system is crucial. How a public distribution system has to be built out of the food commissioner's department, the paddy marketing board, the multi-purpose cooperative society. That was the structure that was there. It's still there, but it has to be revamped with resources. We have to give relief in terms of, because that's, as I mentioned, huge amount of suffering, but also with that stimulus for the agricultural sector, and whether that can be done through deficit spending. And then, of course, when an economy is collapsing, you can just see it collapse before your eyes. Income taxes and revenues are going to be very difficult. Even income taxes. What they did 2 months ago is to increase the VAT, the value-added tax, which is a indirect tax that is hugely regressive. But even income tax is going to be difficult. So can you think of a wealth tax? Because flows are not going to work on accumulated wealth. How would we do that on property, on vehicles? But in the longer term, out of this crisis, how do we change the built environment in terms of public transport, in terms of increasing our production base, and moving away from this idea that real estate and tourism, this one catch-all solution, has completely failed. So those are some of the alternatives. We can think about it more. But the kind of question in my last kind of minute, the larger questions I have is, import substitution became this F word in Sri Lanka. Anytime you talk about, okay, even in agriculture, can we increase local production? We are so import dependent. It was. But is there a way in which globally, internationally, with this crisis, the concept of import substitution might gain more traction? And if so, what would that look like? 2, what does the current crisis mean in terms of rethinking the agrarian question in relation to the food system, in terms of rural-urban relations? Because now we are seeing people actually fall back on subsistence to an extent to be able to address their food needs. 3, deficit spending, because if capital flows are not possible, development financing is going to be difficult from outside. What can we do? And what are the problems in terms of framing it as fiscal expansion through deficit spending for a country like the situation in Sri Lanka, because I think that other countries would be going through that. And finally, I think, even Charles has been talking about the whole question of what does development financing look like and what can we do with local savings. Now, if you take Sri Lanka's kind of savings and investment gap, on the average, our savings about 24, 26%, sometimes 28%, but investment with the 6% from the public sector is about 32%, right? So the 6% gap, what does it really mean? Because a lot of the foreign financing that comes in goes into this kind of infrastructure projects that haven't provided the returns anyway. So we always look to the West or outside or to China or India for development financing, but then we have no control over it. Obviously, all this depends on a complete change in the political system, but that's what the people are demanding. The economists, the intellectual class are way behind the people in terms of addressing these questions. Thank you.